When Europeans arrived at what would become the United States, they did not find untouched terrain. For thousands of years, indigenous populations occupied and left their indelible mark on the landscape. And today on the Deerskin Diary, we are going to look at the clash of two cultures as they coincided with ancient technology and modern firearms. And that's through the use of a gunflint. That's right, folks, it's a deep rabbit hole, but stick around. I know this will spark your interest. Native stone tools are one of the most common pieces of history still located in our communities, but they portray that what looks like a trail washout or farmer's field as a once forgotten place tread by moccasin-soled feet. Now, our early American European settlers found the same things, and they wrote about it at times. One writer, Joseph Doddridge, even went on to say that, quote, "For a long time after the settlement of the country, the Indian arrowheads furnished the main supply of gunflints for our hunters and warriors, many of whom preferred them to the imported flints." Now, this particular quote piqued my interest because Doddridge implies that these ancient stone tools were being used for a purpose that their makers never would have intended them to be used for, and, at least in the 18th century, in a very, very modern context. The gunflint is essential to creating the spark that allows the flintlock to ignite its waiting powder charge. And without it, the gun simply couldn't fire. And they were a wearable part, which meant that you had to have spares for consistent maintenance and functionality. But perhaps most interestingly is the fact that these small stone flints were the only part of the firearms process that indigenous populations could control all on their own. You see, they had the flint knapping skill sets, and they had the access and knowledge of the different types of stones that could be used against the steel to create the spark that was so desperately needed. But is that how it actually happened? For that, we're going to turn to archaeology. For this particular video, the research that I focused on were several archaeological reports, and I'll put those links to some of those in the description so you can read for yourself and see if you found the same thing that I did. Now, what I believe I've found in summarizing these reports is that there indeed were native gunflints being produced by indigenous bifacial flint knapping technology, but the majority of the gunflints that come from these sites still seem to originate in England and France and were a part of the trade network. But was it because the old world gunflints were better, or was it because they were more easily obtained, or maybe both? What seems clear is that native-made or native-produced gunflints from native stones seem to be more prevalent earlier than our time period, so in the late 17th century, for example. And that actually seems to jive pretty well because the established trade networks with Europe weren't quite there yet. Remember, we're talking very early in the colonial days of what would become the United States and North America in general. So it would seem to me that there would be fewer opportunities to purchase or trade for these nicer gunflints in order to make your flintlock work. Native gunflints did exist at both northeastern sites as well as down in Georgia. Jasper, chert, and quartz have all been recovered archaeologically and attributed to gunflint use. Now, we'll also add here that some of those gunflints may also have been strikolites, or small pieces of stone used with steel to make a fire. It is also well known that when a flint and a flintlock was past its use, they were saved and used for strikolites later on, indicating that the item may have been a gunflint at one time that eventually turned into a strikolite. Those native gunflints did exist at several known colonial period sites throughout North America. Tennessee, Georgia, the Northeast, and into Ohio all ring a bell. They were made of quartz, sometimes jasper, sometimes chert, and they were knapped with that bifacial flint knapping technology, which generally indicated some sort of indigenous influence, if not indigenous manufacture itself. The telltale sign of a native-produced gunflint would be the evidence of bifacial flint knapping, which was a hallmark of native knapping techniques, and they were not found on European production gunflints. Now, what this means is the gunflint maker, if you will, is going to remove material from both sides of the gunflint itself and leaving those flint knapping scars. In 1627, near present-day Cape Cod, Plymouth colonists established a trading post, and in one archaeological dig there, they determined that there were a number of homemade gunflints at the site. Fort Mount Pleasant in Georgia was a Yuchi Indian settlement until they abandoned it. Of note here is that it is believed that the Von Rex series of drawings came from Fort Mount Pleasant and the surrounding area. Now later that site was occupied by British traders and then as a military garrison by Georgia Rangers. And this site's fascinating because it reveals the presence of gunflints from Europe as well as native flint knapping of gunflints from native chert. Of the gunflints recovered during that archaeological excavation, 32 were English spall type, 1 was a French spall type, 4 were French blade style, and 5 were bifacially knapped from local stone. Around that same time frame, in 1716, the French built Fort Rosalie near modern-day Natchez, Mississippi. Archaeological excavations there recovered 147 gunflints in all. 2 of them were non-native materials, and 1 was of local native material. The rest were mostly French with some English sprinkled in. Now in this case, non-local native stone would be a type of native North American stone that wasn't necessarily local to the Fort Rosalie area, whereas the local stones would have been something that were indeed usable for gunflints and that were also local to that particular site. Fort Blount was a late 18th century fort located in modern-day Jackson County, Tennessee, and that archaeological dig revealed 7 English blade-style gunflints, with 10 French gunflints and 1 bifacially worked flint of unknown stone origin. The bifacial stoneworking reveals a likely indigenous or native manufacturing process. Probably the most common type of native-made gunflint was native-produced gunflint from non-native stone. This is English flint, and it came over to the colonies as typically as ballast stones in the bellies of ships. So when the ships no longer needed those cobbles or those stones for ballast, they were left in North America, but they had value. They had value as strike-a-lights, and they had value in the production of flints for flintlock weapons. These gunflints were everywhere that flintlock weapons were, and they appear to have a value beyond that as a spark maker to the individual owner. John Lawson, in his 1709 work, A New Voyage to Carolina, indicated that these gunflints were a tradable commodity. He wrote that, quote, "I bought for 2 or 3 flints a large peach loaf made up with a pleasant sort of seed, and this did us a singular kindness in our journey." Now, there are some trends I think we could glean from these reports, and that is that native-made with native stone gunflints seem to be common earlier on when that trade wasn't established quite yet. And they did exist probably as a function to make their gun work with what they had. But again, the overwhelming evidence seems to be imported stones from England and France. So while this wasn't an exhaustive study by any means, the evidence does seem to indicate that there was an overwhelming majority of English and French made and imported gunflints used throughout the frontier by both Euro-Americans and indigenous populations. And I feel that this is important to note because it reveals an issue with us simply using the written word for research purposes. In other words, Doddridge made a bold claim, but when using archaeological evidence from at least a few sites to try to validate that claim, it doesn't seem to add up. But this wouldn't be the Deerskin Diary if we didn't try some of these out. I have with me some English and French gunflints as well as some that I made myself from a local chert from just up here in northwest Georgia. I also have a quartz gunflint, and I also have one made of glass. And the glass one is referred to in an archaeological report in Georgia without a photograph and without additional context. But I figured, hey, I've got some green glass around the house. There's this reference to a green glass gunflint from an archaeological site. Let me nap one out and we'll see how it works. All right, we have a British flint style here. Let's see how it does. Now remember, when you're installing your gunflint, bevel up or bevel down. It really doesn't matter as long as you know what your particular flintlock likes. All right, I've got this one traded out to a French style gunflint now. Let's put some powder in the pan and see how we do. Now, with the bifacially napped stone, and this is made of a chert called Fort Payne chert, with the bifacially napped stone, there is no singular bevel on either side. So we're just gonna have to kind of play with this and see if we can get it to work. I have not tested any of these outside of the camera, so I actually also have no idea how this is gonna go, but I'm pretty excited to find out. All right, the moment of truth. My napped gunflint out of a local type of chert. Let's see how it does. Woo! That was fast. So this one is the quartz. Now it's not quite long enough, so I may have to put a little stick behind it or something to hold it in the jaws to see. The way the stone broke kind of made it like a natural gunflint on its own, but I had to come in here and even up the front. So this spot right here that hits the steel will be relatively consistent. I'm really curious to see how this works because my area is full of quartz, and if this works, then I know that I can, in a pinch, produce my own flint. So you can see what I'm going to do here is just put this stick behind the flint to push it out towards the steel just a little bit more. Obviously I can't leave it overhanging too far or it will interfere when it hits the stock. So I've got to just kind of find exactly the right size as a little wedge. Let's see how this guy right here does. All right, homemade quartz gunflint. Well, I'd say that works. Now this one's the one I'm really curious about. This is the green glass gunflint here. I've napped it out of the bottom of a bottle, not a Heineken bottle, but a spring water bottle, and it's got some thickness to it. It might be just a tad long, but let's see. Now what I'm worried about here is shattering. I'm worried that this is going to just hit the steel itself and then just completely shatter. But hey, wouldn't be the Deerskin Diary if we didn't try it out and see if it works. So let's put it in and see what happens. All right, this is the green glass gunflint. Let's see how this goes. Nothing on the first one, but there's plenty of glass still left. Let's try it again. Nothing on the second. Flint's starting to come apart a little bit. Maybe it's just slightly oversized. Let's keep going, see what we can get. I don't know. It's definitely hitting somewhere down in the middle here, which we wanted up a little bit higher. I might take it out, flip it over, and see if we get a better result. Okay, I've flipped the glass over to the other side. Let's see if we get any better results this time. Not that time. Let's keep going just a little bit. See what we can get. That doesn't look good. One more time. I think I'm figuring out here that if I were ever stuck somewhere with a flintlock and no flints and a number of Heineken bottles, I'd be better off making flint out of other stone or making arrowheads and spear points out of the Heineken bottles. All right, one more time. I would say glass is a dud. All right, we still have some powder in the pan from that failed glass expedition there, so I am going to reshoot this chert point, or this chert flint that I made, because it was the hardest one to make. It's the one I'm most proud of, and it's my video, so I'm going to do it this way. Let's see if we can get a second spark ignition. Ooh, we got sparks, but not enough to ignite the powder. Let's do it again. More sparks, but not quite enough to ignite the powder. Let's get that cleaned off a little bit. Get that cleaned off a little bit. Let's go one more time. There it is. Well, this was definitely a fun one to do. Take a quote from Joseph Doddridge that talked about discarded native stone tools being used as gunflints in the early part of our settlement history. And then taking that quote and comparing it with modern day archaeological reports to see just how common that might have been. And then take that information and make a couple of different types of gunflints and try them out in a flintlock. Now, what I found here today, besides the obvious, is that you can't expect ignition from other types of stones, but I think maybe a first round ignition rate of fire is probably more of a modern context for us than it would have been back then. In other words, I don't know that ignition every time you pulled the trigger was an expectation that many of our 18th century ancestors may have had. What I do know is that I greatly appreciate the amount of time that you spend watching these videos, and I hope you get something out of it as much as I get, at least out of making them. And we'll see you next time on the Deerskin Diary.